You've found the Rube Goldberg Machine of Semiotics and Symbols podcast. RGMS is an artist collective and independent research journal engaging in experimental music works ranging from lush soundscapes to near barren field recordings, and controlled chaos to meditative canopies. Since late 2020, RGMS has released a wide variety of both albums and research publications. Find them on the website at r-g-m-s.com. Today, co-founders Sean Kiley and Davis Connors will be discussing the first research publication, The Meaning Behind RGMS. For a link to the publication, see the show notes. Also in the show notes is the RGMS Patreon support link. If you'd like access to exclusive content, join there and consider supporting RGMS to make more podcasts like this possible for the future. Thanks for listening in.
When you really think about it, when you put music against a mirror, it seems to dissolve. By nature, it is abstract. Here, we sense some invisible forces, which play out in our lives. These unconscious elements, abounding in the realm of the abstract. The track you just heard was from the first RGMS album called Undercover Corner, and you can find that on just about any streaming platform. But now, for the research publication at hand, which really groups together concepts behind the name of the collective, which in full is the Rube Goldberg Machine of Semiotics and Symbols, or for short, RGMS. We're looking at the metaphor of the Rube Goldberg Machine, and this helps us cultivate an understanding of just what deeper meaning may be hidden within these invisible forces behind the music. So, Sean, I think we could start with this simple question. Could you tell us what's this publication really getting at?
Well, firstly, thanks for the introduction, Davis. But yeah, this publication, the meaning behind RGMS. So the Rube Goldberg machine can be thought of as the vehicle through which the RGMS strives to not only cultivate, but also develop methods of participation with meaning from musical experiences through the lens of semiotics and symbols. Musical experiences have this unique ability to create a sense of ineffable understanding or to heighten the effect of an event. However, this experience of profundity has a tendency to get trapped, so to speak, in a single moment in time, insofar as we're unable to maintain that elevated state of mind outside of the instant itself. And of course, it has its residual effects, the sort of high one feels after walking out of a concert, but those fade rather quickly. Mm. I liken it to like having a near-death experience where one's appreciation of life is renewed and even the most mundane becomes overwhelmingly precious, but sometime later the mundane is back to being, unnoteworthy or even bothersome.
Mm.
So this research publication is about beginning to develop a method which formalizes an approach to the variety of meaningful experiences, as well as a heuristic which allows for reflection and subsequent integration of the experience itself. One could say it's a way of engaging with music which hopes to catalyze a more active participation with the more transcendent quality of music. So here we're trying to show how Rube Goldberg and his machines very much predicates or outlines this idea.
Okay. So tell me, who the heck is this Rube Goldberg, and what are his machines?
So Rube Goldberg was an American cartoonist working in the early part of the 20th century. He's also a bit of a legendary figure shrouded in some mystery.
Oh.
Many consider him a metaphysical engineer operating in the tradition of the Egyptian god Thoth. But anyway, the machines he would draw in these cartoons, or perhaps blueprints, are essentially designed to perform a very simple task in an indirect and overly complicated manner.
Mm-hmm.
And usually they consist of simple, unrelated devices, the action of which each one triggers the initiation of the next, eventually resulting in achieving a stated goal. And the best example is the famous Professor Butts and the self-operating napkin from 1931. And in this one, we have our subject, Professor Butts, with his great big mustache, trying to accomplish the task of wiping his chin with a napkin in the most labyrinthine fashion possible. So, starting with the soup spoon, which is raised to the mouth, the soup spoon pulls a string, which jerks a ladle, which throws a cracker past a toucan, and then the toucan jumps after the cracker, which makes the perch tilt and upsets the seeds, which fall into the pail. The extra weight in the pail pulls a cord, which opens and ignites the lighter and sets off a skyrocket, which causes the sickle to cut the string, allowing the pendulum with the attached napkin to swing back and forth, thereby wiping the chin.
Ah. Yeah, and I want to remind folks that they can see this in action in the actual publication we're talking about, which is on the website and in the show notes. But moving on, I'm wondering in terms of the name Rube Goldberg Machine of Semiotics and Symbols, what are these semiotics and symbols?
So essentially, semiotics is the study of signs. You have signifiers and signified, each of which represents the other. A good example is a traffic light. A red light signals us to stop. Semiotics is also rather apparent in language. For instance, we have the word tree, which is the signifier, and the tree itself, which is being signified. In music, semiotics functions on the level of notation. And notation or written music is nothing more than a system of signs to convey meaning to a performer. As in, you there, clarinetist, play me this note. The note on the page is representative of the frequency produced or experienced.
Right.
And similarly, semiotics operates beyond conventional notation with electronic mediums and new modes of musical expression. So here, instead of note heads, clefs, key signatures, you have faders, keys, knobs, lines of code, what have you, that represent certain sonic outcomes. For instance, a fader raised up all the way indicates a loud dynamic level of a particular sound.
Right.
Now, symbols, on the other hand, may be thought of as intricately woven signs. And the meaning of symbols evokes not only a singular signified thing, but rather many possible abstractions and interpretations associated with the signifier. A classic example is a mandala, which essentially is a collection of signs and other symbols crafted into a concentric pattern. The cross is also an excellent example of a symbol, since it has meaning which is beyond the signifier-signified relationship. And you could sit there all day explaining just what it means. Then you could get another individual's take on it and get a completely different answer. So unlike semiotics or signs, which are static, symbols are dynamic because they don't just indicate one idea or thing. And oftentimes they'll change over time or between cultures. In language, poetry is best thought of as symbolic. Of course, you have the literal symbolist movement, but anything which isn't for the purpose of communication in language is really symbolic. And of course, we have symbols in music. For example, Beethoven's Fifth. The point is not to literally think the notes on the page, G, 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 E flat, F, 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 D. But rather something more abstract, elusive, ephemeral, and perhaps dreamlike.
Mm-hmm.
It's often popularly interpreted as like the knocking on the door by fate.
What else could that be?
But that sort of turns it into a sign. And really, it's something which we cannot even begin to put into imagery, since another individual may well have a completely opposite interpretation.
Okay, so yeah, that's great. And I think we have a good understanding of the elements of the name itself, but I want to see now if we can pivot into more of the esoteric and philosophical underpinnings of the publication. I noticed the publication mentioned something about the nature of language and our inability to definitively answer the question of where it comes from. So, can you go into that, expand it a little bit?
Yeah. So this essay is dealing with two fundamental questions, which can be applied to a variety of fields. The first of which is, where does it come from, or where is it going? And the second of which is, what is it for? So, in respects to language, we can answer the question, what is it for? And simply put, for communication, besides poetry. However, we'd have more of a difficult time answering the question, where did language come from?
Right.
And there are three main approaches or perspectives that you could take on this. The first of which is, did words become signifiers from a mimetic tradition, which evolves through an imitation of nature? Or were they imparted to us from some divine beings where the word is representative of the thing itself? Or perhaps it's all just a matter of convention, wherein one culture calls a hammer a screwdriver. Ultimately, we really can't know, and we can provide sound arguments for each, but since we ourselves weren't there at the inception of language, it all becomes a form of speculation.
Right.
Philosophy, on the other hand, grapples with these same questions, but unlike language, philosophy has a great difficulty answering this question of what is it for, what is life for. Never mind where does it come from or where it's going.
All right. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you want to also expand on why philosophy has such a difficulty trying to answer these questions concerning meaning?
Yeah, so fundamentally, this question of meaning and purpose, by knowing what it is for, one can act accordingly with this principle, which strives to be beyond the self. And this is what codes of ethics or dogmas purport to do. So depending on the philosophical system or approach that one is operating in, you can reach different versions of truth or absolute truth, which claim to answer once and for all this question of meaning. And this is why we have various religious denominations asserting their understanding of the divine is the one true understanding. And if all of these philosophers and religious organizations profess opposing things about what life is for and about the nature of reality, they can't all be completely right, can they? So,
Right.
so to me, it seems that every claim to absolute truth, there's always this looming counter-argument. And ultimately, this is because all apologetics to absolute truth are predicated by one's a priori assumptions about the nature of reality or one's metaphysics. So, for instance, if you take Francis Bacon's claim about the primacy of material, you'd conclude that consciousness only arises out of organic matter. But on the other hand, if you're working in the Platonic tradition, it's just the opposite. So each of these positions leads to radically different worldviews about the nature of reality, and therefore the meaning of life. What is it for? Which they both declare to prove incontrovertibly.
Right.
So I've come to see this question of what is it for as more ineffable and transcendent, as in it can't actually be articulated. It's rather
Right.
confined to the experience of something. And that's not to say that we can't use the intellect to further our relationship with meaning itself, but rather we must be very wary of static forms. The meaning must be symbolic or dynamic and not semiotic. So bringing this all back, in many respects, the Rube Goldberg machine operates as an inversion to philosophy when dealing with questions of meaning as such.
Can you say more about this philosophical inversion?
So in philosophy, we begin with an unknown. It's the question, what is life? What is it for? Whereas with the Rube Goldberg machine, we start with a known, somewhere we've been before, a rather simple or banal task. Wiping one's chin with a napkin in the case of Professor Butts. So fundamentally, it's a difference of destination, known versus unknown. And that has drastic consequences when approaching the subject of meaning. Because in the case of the Rube Goldberg machine, we've experienced it before, the meaning. And now we're just having fun with it, trying out ways to make the experience all the more profound. Whereas in philosophy, we don't necessarily have to have actually experienced meaning before. It's an unknown. So we may well stumble upon it and not even realize that we have, or we could reach some semblance of it and think, look here, I found it. When really, we made some catastrophic error or wrong turn, because humans are prone to self-deception and oversights in general.
Right. Well, so yeah, we've kind of done a good job at laying out this foundation, and I want to see now if we can dive into art, maybe specifically music. I guess the way I could phrase it as a question is, how does music deal with these questions of meaning, and how would that be different from philosophy?
Sure. So similar to language, we can't really answer that question of where music came from. It all becomes ultimately speculative because we haven't been there at the inception of music itself, just like we haven't been there when the first words were spoken. But we can answer the question of what music is for, because we have been there. We've had an experience of music where it all of a sudden inspired some ineffable understanding within us. Or if we haven't, we've engaged with it in such a way that instills meaning. And that's just it, because music is for the purpose of instilling meaning. Therefore, music by nature is symbolic, as opposed to language, which can become symbolic through poetry. And we use symbols to develop relationships with those things that transcend us. That is, if we're humble enough to do so. And music essentially charges an experience with something that's beyond the rational domain. Even in its practical applications, therapeutic, entertainment, there's an unconscious level of meaning being transmitted to the listener. And the whole trick of it really is to become conscious of what kind of meaning you're getting out of your experience.
Ah, okay. And how does this participatory meaning from music relate back to Rube Goldberg machines?
So, to start, we first have to address the question of whether or not we are perhaps misinterpreting Rube's machines, by trying to construct them on a material level, when we might rather understand them metaphysically and in relationship to the experience of meaning. With this in mind, we might consider how these machines instead propose a sort of synthesis between philosophy and music. So, to explain this, philosophy asks the
Hmm.
question, what is it for, music or life? But music is able to provide the answer. This experience of meaning in music is the ineffable answer to the philosophical question, what is life for?
Hmm.
The point is that there's no literal answer to that question. There is only doing and experiencing.
Mm.
And the goal of music is to coax one's spirit, so to speak, into engagement with a transcendent phenomenon or noumenal content, if you will. The machine, Rube Goldberg's machine, ultimately conveys a phenomenon very similar to that of music, at least for the process of a composer.
Hmm.
In composing a piece, there's some initial spark of inspiration which contains meaning in itself. And this is the proverbial wiping of one's chin with a napkin. It's a known, we have discovered it. And usually a good composer will resist just handing over this initial inspiration to the listener because that's what a cliche is. So rather than beating a dead horse, the composer develops a larger framework through which this meaning will be arrived at. Just like the machine, the composer constructs a new way of achieving the experience, thereby elevating its profundity. And you can imagine the experience of wiping your chin via Professor Butt's self-operating napkin machine would be all the more memorable than when you did it last night at dinner.
Right.
And in the case of music, that experience which is elevated is one of meaning or understanding of your place in the cosmos. So now that we have an answer to this question of meaning, so to speak, the question is, how can we create a more participatory engagement with it? Well, philosophy provides us with two possibilities, the first of which is methodology. Essentially, by complexifying our methodology to arrive at meaning, much like philosophy does with logic in order to arrive at some varied form of truth, we can augment the effect of the experience of meaning itself, as well as begin to formalize and understand the varied approaches. This is ostensibly the creation of musical forms or new musical forms in the case of RGMS. Secondly, is the development of a heuristic. And to clarify, heuristics are techniques, models, or methods which serve to further one's ability to learn and elicit feedback in order to improve performance or comprehension. So a heuristic derived from a music may function as an intermediary to the experience of the thing itself and provide a manner of dialoguing with the ineffable or transcendent. So therefore, we would strive to develop a heuristic which allows us to reflect upon the symbolic nature of music and the experience of meaning which is inspired through it. And by beginning to express this symbolic function of the operative ideas in a work through reflecting on how they may be representative of the composer's own psyche, say, we can begin to codify an understanding of not only how this experience of meaning comes about through methodology, but also a why through heuristics, thus cultivating a way of participating with meaning outside of the experience itself. ultimately, in many respects, this publication may be considered a sort of polemic against the static forms of heuristics being perpetrated by these supposed self-help gurus.
Hmm.
A heuristic, to be truly effective, has to also function on the level of a symbol. Again, meaning it has to be dynamic or willing to change with the experience and new experiences or with the presentation of new data. So one person's heuristic does not necessarily transfer to the psyche of another individual. The only way to access meaning, true meaning, is to first and foremost find a way of engaging with it. You can't just discover meaning through a model somebody else dreamt up, because it would be antithetical to your potential as a human being. We can learn these heuristics dreamt up by great sages, and we can learn from them. But ultimately, we must build our own if we want to further our relationship with meaning. This is what the RGMS hopes to inspire, not only in the composer, but in the listener as well. Because in the realm of music, which is symbolic, anyone may access the transcendent.
Right. And could you also expand on the heuristic in the relationship to the experience of meaning?
So yeah, let's take the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, for instance.
Okay.
In 1913 or so, Jung has this transcendent experience, which takes place over a significant period of time. And he documents it in what's now called the Red Book or Liber Novus.
Hmm.
So this experience consists of visions of World War I before it occurs, like the whole North Sea turning to blood, and visions of heaven and hell, conversations with the prophet Elijah, a whole, mystical experience. And he called this an encounter with the unconscious. So as I understand it, he was genuinely concerned that he was going mad, since the level of the experience was so overwhelming. But rather than be overcome by the weight of the experience itself, he starts to develop an understanding of the landscape of his psyche, which is being presented to him through the experience. And this culminates in his work Ion, or Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, in, I think, 1951. Essentially, this mapping of the psyche taken from his experience functions as a heuristic, or a way of dialoguing with and understanding the encounter with the unconscious, which was an experience that carried a great level of meaning within it. So in Ion, he formalizes the concepts of, the shadow, anima, animus, and ego, and how the ego rests on the infinite plane of the self. And I won't go into it in detail. You can dive into it on your own accord. But the point is that from this experience of meaning, Jung developed a heuristic which allowed him to cultivate a relationship with that meaning from the experience throughout his whole life. So, for instance, in identifying the shadow which presented itself to him amidst the experience, and then giving it a name and a place within the psyche, he can now see how this force plays out in his life elsewhere and beyond the experience. So we can also take these concepts of psyche Jung develops and apply them to our own lives and see very well how the forces play out. However, our individual experience of meaning, or encounters with the unconscious, if you will, they won't be replicas of Jung's experience. And for most of us, it may not be that intense. So in light of this, we ought to develop our own way of dialoguing with these experiences if we want to integrate them in the manner in which they desire. Otherwise, we'll be just trying to graft someone else's experience onto our own, which is an injustice to the experience itself. It's the proverbial trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And in Jung's case, this is an example of an experience of meaning on more of a macro level. However, we have experience of meanings constantly on a micro level. They're what renews faith in ourselves and drives our goals. And oftentimes these experiences may be catalyzed by a piece of music. Of course, we can also have macro experiences through music, and this is the ultimate aim of the composer, but they're far less common.
Right.
So therefore, rather than the RGMS developing a heuristic which can serve which we can serve to the listener on a platter, the point is to encourage this self-exploration in the realm of the symbolic. The composer ostensibly catalyzes the symbolic nature of the music by formulating some semblance of a heuristic. And it doesn't have to be nearly as sophisticated as Ion, because remember, Jung started to have these visions in 1913 and only published Ion some 40 years later. So the characters that play in the experience may reveal themselves over long intervals of time and in a variety of places or pieces of music. The point is, to begin thinking in this way opens you up to the possibilities.
So ultimately, what then is the goal of the artist or music maker in the context of this understanding we're talking about?
So just like the Rube Goldberg machine, the composer has the experience of meaning in mind at both the starting point and the end point of music. And again, the point of composition is to amplify that meaning derived from the original idea which inspired you. That motif from Beethoven's Fifth is our known destination. Yet the meaning of those 4 or so notes themselves, the meaning that those notes inspire in us pales in comparison to the context to which it's placed. The motif is the proverbial wiping of the chin with the napkin, while the symphony is the machine, which takes us there. The destination is nothing without the journey.
Interesting. Okay.
And we focus on the question of participation and how we might communicate that both through the experience, the methodology, and the heuristic.
Beautiful. I think we made kind of a full circle here, but there is something I want to clear up.
Sure.
Something that I've been kind of grappling with, but so the research publication is at once serious, kind of like this conversation, but other times it's seemingly absurd. At times it reads as mythology or has the feel of a religious doctrine, but these are these just simply useful metaphors, or is there something deeper that you believe in?
So this is all just derived from the simple axiom that all teleology is mythology. And by teleology, I mean the explanation of phenomena in terms of the purpose they serve, rather than that of the cause by which they arise.
Mm-hmm.
So an example of this is the idea that AI creates itself retroactively from some distant point in the future, and that the endeavor of mankind is ever towards this technological singularity. This practice is ultimately nothing more than an exercise in myth-making, since we can't separate our cultural and individual experience from our interpretations.
Okay, so hold on. I'm going to ask more. I'm going to ask more directly. So, do you? Let me phrase it this way: do you actually believe Rube Goldberg himself was hinting at these lofty ideas and deconstructions through some kind of esoteric code in his cartoons that would then become uncovered years later, here in 2021? I mean, we're talking about a napkin here, right?
Well, I'd say that's neither here nor there. From the name springs everything. It has been said that at the moment of birth, the spirit of the child will often whisper its own name into the mother's ear, and the dynamic, symbolic meaning of that name will unfold throughout its life. From here, at the inception of the name, the Rube Goldberg machine of semiotics and symbols, the collective moves towards its fate. Not so much in the sense of predetermined manifestation, but rather the archetypal guiding principles under the influence of which we shall develop and issue forth. The meaning of the RGMS shall thence be to cultivate meaning, taking our experience in this material realm to new heights and dynamic forms, opening the pathways towards the participatory experience, through which meaning envelops the totality of our sense of being.